I was just passing through, looking for coin and liquor when I stumbled into Mirebrook. No one welcomed me, and I didn't care. But when night fell, the earth itself vomited out creatures made of sinew and bone. I killed them, with my blade and bare hands. That should have been the end, but it turned out to be just the beginning. I wasn't looking for a place to die, just a place to disappear. The road had long since vanished behind me. Not just the path itself, swallowed by mud and fog, but the idea of road, of destination. For days I had wandered the fetid reaches of the Mirelands, my boots soaked and rotting, my stomach gnawing on itself, and my sword useless against the kind of foes that bled from memory more than flesh. Cold rain bit into my shoulders like teeth. I'd wrapped myself in a stolen cloak, dark wool slicked black with swamp water and other things I tried not to name. My name? Doesn't matter. Not yet. No one in Mirebrook asked me for it either. I came upon the village the way a corpse floats into view. Slow, soggy, and mostly silent. One moment I was staring at twisted bog trees and the thin tendrils of morning mist curling around my legs like grave wrappings. And the next, there it was. Mirebrook, just a slump of wooden hovels built half into the earth, half out of fear. Rotten timber, thatched roofs slick with moss, smoke that rose like prayer from crooked chimneys. The whole place smelled like mold, rot, and despair. The scent of people who had learned to live without hope, or buried it under the mud like everything else. No one greeted me when I arrived. No children ran to gawk. No farmers paused with pitchforks. No suspicious elder squinted from a doorway. It was quiet, but not empty. I saw their eyes, behind shutters, through cracks in broken boards, reflections in puddles. Watching, judging, hating. Not me, not exactly. Just anything new. Anything that didn't belong. I wasn't offended. I didn't belong anywhere anymore. I pushed open the door of the Crooked Tavern, if you could call it that, and ducked inside. The sign outside had long since lost its letters, but I could smell boiled roots, damp ale, and burnt meat inside. Warmth, firelight, that was enough. The innkeeper was a thin man with lips like dried fish and eyes too far apart. His name, I'd later learn, was Harl, but that night he just nodded once and pointed to a table without speaking. No welcome, no prices. Just a chair. I dropped into it like a sack of wet stones. There were others in the room. 2 men sharpening knives by the hearth, their gazes flicking up only briefly when I entered. A woman in the corner with a hood over her face, her fingers tracing something on the wood grain. An old man asleep with his head on a mug. No one said a word. I could feel it, the weight of silence. Not awkwardness. Fear. Fear stretched so tight over their bones it had become routine. I waited. After a while, Harl brought me a bowl of some kind of stew and a tankard of something that tasted like rotgut and river water. I ate it anyway. Hunger doesn't care about taste. I didn't ask about a room. I just laid my sword beside me on the bench and let the warmth soak into my ruined boots. A few of them glanced at the weapon. Not long, just enough to mark me. Let them think what they wanted. Sellsword, outlaw, killer, all true at one time or another. I was scraping the last of the gristle from the bowl when the first scream tore through the village. It wasn't the scream of a child or a woman, high and helpless. It was guttural, ragged. A man, maybe strong once. Not anymore. Everyone in the inn froze. Even the fire seemed to stop crackling. No one moved. No one even breathed. The scream came again, closer this time. Then the sound of something heavy dragging through mud. Wet footsteps. Not boots. Not hooves. Something else. Something with weight and rot in every step. I stood up. The others didn't. The woman in the corner just lowered her head further into her hood. The knife men stared at their blades. Harl picked up a cloth and began wiping the counter with trembling hands, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I realized then that this wasn't new to them. This was routine. That scream, it had happened before. I took my sword. It was old, notched, a bastard blade with no name, like me. but it still held an edge. Outside, the fog had thickened. The houses looked more like gravestones now. I followed the scream through the muck until I reached the square. A patch of flattened earth surrounded by crooked buildings and an ancient tree at its center. Its branches hung with ribbons and rotted charms. There was blood in the mud, fresh, still steaming. Then I saw it. Gods. It stood half in shadow, hunched over something, someone, twitching in the dirt. It was human-shaped, mostly, but wrong. Skinless, glimmering with pale muscle and black veins. Its head was a tangle of exposed sinew and lidless eyes that wept clear fluid down its stretched face. Its mouth opened too wide, full of teeth that didn't belong in any mortal body. Its limbs twitched like it didn't know how they worked, or remembered too well. Turned to me. No roar, no charge, just silence, and the slow, wet shift of its stance as it watched me with hungerless curiosity, like it recognized me, or maybe just the weapon in my hand. I didn't give it time to remember. I moved, fast. My blade caught it across the chest, and for a moment the thing just stood there, staring at the wound like it had never seen one before. Then it shrieked, not from pain but from confusion. It was like I'd broken a rule. Then it lunged. We fought in the mud, the rain, the dark. Its claws were fast, but not faster than me. It had strength, but not skill. I'd fought worse things in better places. I don't remember how long it lasted. Just that when it was over, I was kneeling in the bloody dirt, panting, my blade buried in its throat. It didn't bleed much. What came out was black, thick, and full of twitching things that sizzled on the ground. When I looked up, the villagers were there, watching. No one clapped. No one thanked me. Some of them looked afraid, others angry. One man spat in the dirt. And the woman in the hood? She stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes glowing faintly beneath the shadow of her cowl. Not fear, not gratitude, just understanding, like she'd been waiting for this, waiting for me. She turned and walked away without a word. That was my welcome to Mirebrook. I should have left that night. I should have known that killing the creature wasn't the end. It was the beginning, and the mud hadn't finished with me yet. I didn't sleep that night, not for lack of trying. The bed they gave me, if you could call it that, was a pile of damp hay and a thin blanket that smelled like mildew and piss. It creaked like a dying thing under my weight, and the wind whispered through cracks in the wall like it had secrets to share. But that wasn't why sleep didn't come. I've slept on stones, in snowbanks, under corpses. What kept me awake that night was the sound. It started after midnight, a low hum, too deep to be wind, too steady to be the creak of branches. It pulsed, faint and rhythmic, like something enormous was breathing beneath the soil. At first I thought it was my imagination, a trick of nerves after the fight. But the walls shook with it, ever so slightly. And then came the voices, not from outside, from beneath. They whispered just beneath hearing, curling up through the cracks in the floor like smoke. Not words I knew, not a language spoken by anything with a tongue. But I felt them, in my bones, in the base of my skull, soft and slithering and ancient, a lullaby for the dead. I sat up, hand on my sword, but I didn't draw it. What would steel do against voices? Against breath from the deep? The whispering stopped just before dawn. That was when the screaming began again. Only this time it didn't come from outside. Came from inside the village. I bolted from the bed, pulling my boots on with half-frozen fingers and strapping the sword to my back. The tavern was silent. No Harl, no patrons. The hearth was cold. I stepped out into the mist. The sky was still gray and bleeding into the edges of night. No sun, no birdsong. Mirebrook never had the decency to look alive, but now it looked dead. Then I saw the smoke. It curled up from the edge of the village, past the shrine tree, past the square where I'd killed that thing the night before. I followed it, not because I cared, not then, but because the screaming hadn't stopped. I found them in the eastern edge of the village, where the shacks met the swamp proper. A ramshackle hovel half submerged in muck, its door hanging open, the wood slick with something that wasn't water. Inside, carnage. Blood slicked the floor. Black veins crawled up the walls like something had tried to grow out of the house. A child lay twitching near the hearth, his body convulsing like his own skin was trying to crawl away. A woman, his mother maybe, sobbed over him, her hands red and shaking. And the old man in the corner, he was already gone, face half torn away, eyes open, mouth slack. They didn't see me at first. The boy was the only one making sound, and it wasn't screaming anymore. It was worse, a low gurgle, like he was choking on his own voice. His skin had turned the color of wax, and there were holes beneath his ribs, as if something had burrowed in. Or out. The mother saw me. Her face shifted, not to relief, not to anger, but to something else entirely. She whispered a word, over and over. Mireborn, Mireborn. That was the first time I heard the name. Then the boy stopped moving. I stepped closer against my better judgment. His eyes were open, glassy. And then, God's help me, he smiled. Only it wasn't his mouth that smiled. His lips didn't move, but a tear opened across his cheek, curling upward like a second grin, wet and raw and grinning wide. A sound came from it. Not a voice, not quite. Like the croaking of frogs layered atop each other, too fast and too many. The woman screamed and struck the body with her fists. The thing inside hissed just once and then went still. I left, not out of fear. I'd seen worse, but something about the way she wept, it was personal, like she'd known this would happen, like this was the price paid for something else. When I turned back toward the center of the village, she didn't call for help. She didn't even look at me. She just held her son's body and whispered that word again. Mireborn. The others were waiting for me when I returned to the square. Same faces, same silence, but this time someone stepped forward. The woman from the night before, the one in the hood. She removed it. Her name was Theraline. She looked young at first, smooth skin, high cheekbones, eyes like smoke and river water. But there was a weight behind those eyes, an old sadness, the kind you don't get without burying friends. Family, faith. Her hair was bound in braids threaded with bone beads, and strange tattoos curled along her throat like ivy. I need to show you something, she said. I didn't speak, just nodded. She led me past the shrine tree, deeper into the village, toward a building half sunken into the earth. A chapel of sorts, built from black stone and draped in rotting linens. It smelled like damp iron and old prayers. No symbols I recognized, just a circle of thorns carved into the arch above the door. Inside it was dark, but not empty. The floor was covered in bones. Not human or not entirely. Some too long. Some fused with things that should never be bone. Spiral growths, barbed spines, clawed sockets. They were laid out in patterns. Ritualistic, desperate. This is where we bind them, Theraline said softly. The Mireborn. I asked her what they were. She looked at me like she didn't believe I'd killed one. They are the memory of the swamp, she said. Old sins, buried pain. The pact was made before my time, before any of ours. We live on their land. We feed them our dead. In return, they leave us be. I didn't speak, just let her words settle like ash. The one you killed, she said. It wasn't meant to be out. It was broken, woken too early. That's why they're afraid of you. I'm not from here, I replied. I don't care about their pacts. You should, she said, because it knows you now, and it doesn't forget. I left the chapel with more questions than answers. Back at the inn, no one met my eyes. Harl gave me another bowl of stew, but this time he kept his hands low, like he thought I might strike him. Maybe I would have in another life. I sat in the same place, same bench, same fire, but the village had changed. Or maybe I had. When I finally fell asleep, curled in that damp pile of straw and rot, I dreamt of eyes, thousands of them, beneath the mud, watching me, waiting, and a voice, deep and cold, whispering just one thing. You broke the pact, stranger. They buried the boy in silence. No prayers, no songs, just a hole dug in the muck behind the chapel, the mother lowering him into the earth with her own hands. mud caking her sleeves and face like war paint. I watched from a distance, standing beneath the drooping branches of the dead willow by the well. No one else came, not even Theraline. The grave was shallow. The soil here is always wet, always ready to take what it's owed. I thought she might say something before she covered him, something soft or broken or final. But she didn't. She just stood over the boy's body for a while, unmoving, her hair slicked to her face by the drizzle. Then she began to weep, not with sobs, but with a soundless shudder, like something inside her had split and would never heal. I'd seen grief before. Gods know I've caused enough of it. But this was different. It wasn't loss. It was payment. By dusk, she was gone. They sealed the grave with stones, not wood. That's how they do it here, to keep what's beneath from remembering how to climb back out. I returned to the tavern, hoping for fire and distraction, but the hearth was cold. The villagers didn't speak to me, didn't look at me. They sat in corners and shadows, their faces pinched like withered fruit, muttering to themselves. Harl pretended not to notice me. I didn't press him. Instead, I stared into the embers and tried to understand what I'd stepped into. The truth is, I'd come to Mirebrook to vanish. A broken cell's word with blood on my hands and no home worth returning to. The Black Banner had disbanded months ago after our commander was flayed alive in a noble's trap. We were mercenaries, nothing more, and I'd done things for coin I no longer wanted to remember. Killing monsters? Easier than killing men. Cleaner. But this wasn't coin work. This was penance. That night I dreamt again. But it wasn't a nightmare. It was memory. I was young again, standing in the rain outside the charred ruin of our farmhouse. My brother's body still smoldered in the wreckage. My father was gone. Maybe dead, maybe just fled. And my mother had left days before, walking into the marsh and never coming back. I was alone, and I remember hearing it then, faint and terrible beneath the storm. The hum, just like in Mirebrook. I'd buried that sound with 1,000 miles of killing. But the swamp never forgets. When I woke, someone was standing in the doorway of my room. Theraline. She didn't knock, didn't speak. She just looked at me. There was something different about her now. A tension in the way she held herself, like a coiled rope ready to snap. Her skin was pale in the gray light, but her eyes burned dark, hollow with sleeplessness. "They opened another one," she said. I sat up, hand already reaching for my sword. "Another what?" "Grave," she said. "Something's coming out, and we don't know why." She led me beyond the chapel this time, deep into the old grove, a stretch of trees strangled by moss and rot. The ground sucked at our boots with every step, and the air grew colder, heavier. Here, even the crows didn't dare to cry. At the center of the grove was a mound of black earth, cracked and steaming like a wound. The grass around it had withered to ash. Roots jutted from the soil like broken bones. Theraline didn't speak. She just pointed. The mound pulsed. It wasn't my imagination. The earth rose and fell like something underneath it was breathing. Slow, patient, a heartbeat from below. "What is it?" I asked. "The beginning," she whispered. "Or the end. We don't know anymore." I crouched beside it, pressing a hand to the dirt. It was warm, too warm. "Why now?" I said. "Why me?" She looked at me, and I could tell she'd asked herself the same question 100 times already. "There's something in your blood," she said. "Something the Mireborn remember." I pulled back. "I'm not from here." "No," she said, "but something followed you." The ground beneath us shuddered, just once, like a cough or a stir of old flesh. Then the air turned cold. We spun as the mist thickened behind us. Not the normal village fog, but something denser, darker, like smoke from burning flesh. A shape moved through it, tall, bent, cloaked in wet shadows. No eyes, just long fingers and a stitched mouth, sealed with iron wire. I stepped between it and Theraline, blade in hand, but the thing didn't attack. It stopped a few paces away, crooked head tilting as if it were listening. Then, in a voice not its own, a voice borrowed from 1,000 dying throats, it spoke, He remembers. The words weren't meant for her. They were meant for me. I moved. Steel met mist. The blade cut through the thing's arm, or where an arm should have been, and it screamed not with pain but with loss. The fog scattered, and it staggered back, leaking black fluid that hissed as it hit the ground. But it didn't die. Instead, it dropped to its knees and vanished into the soil, swallowed, gone. We stood in silence. Theraline looked at me with new fear in her eyes. Not of the creature, of me. What did it mean? She asked. I didn't answer, because I already knew. That voice in the fog, that stitched thing, it was something old. Older than Mirebrook, older than the Pact. And it remembered me, not for who I was, but for what I'd done. There are things buried in my past, things I bled for, things I tried to forget. But the Mireborn don't forget. They feed on memory, on guilt, on wounds that never close. And somewhere, in that rot-filled earth, something had begun to stir. Because I was here, because I'd come back, and the swamp wanted what it was owed. There's a part of Mirebrook the villagers won't speak of, not out of fear, but out of reverence. You can see it in their eyes when you mention it, the way their shoulders tense, the way their mouths go flat and their gazes drift to the floor like they're remembering something that never truly left. They call it the Hollow, but no one I asked could tell me where it was or what it meant. Only Theraline dared speak the name aloud. And even she whispered it like a curse. The Hollow is where she lives, she told me not long after the stitched mouth thing vanished into the muck. The one who keeps the Pact. The one who speaks to the Mireborn. I asked her if she had a name. She just said, we call her the Swamp Priestess. But the Mireborn call her Mother. I should have walked away. Gods know I wanted to. Every instinct I'd learned over 2 decades of blood and war screamed at me to leave this cursed bog behind, to ride until the air was dry and my skin forgot the feel of rot. But it was too late. The swamp knew me now, and the dead do not let go. So I told Theraline to take me to her. She didn't argue. We left at dawn. Mist still clung to the earth like a shroud, thick enough to taste. The village faded behind us with every step, swallowed by vines and silence. Theraline led the way with a staff carved from dead alder, its surface etched with runes I didn't recognize. She said little, only glancing back now and then to make sure I hadn't turned around. The hollow wasn't marked on any path. No torches, no stones, not even the crooked wooden totems that lined the outskirts of Mirebrook. Just a trail of sunken roots and stunted trees that bled black sap from old wounds. The deeper we went, the stranger the air became. It pressed in around us, thick with the scent of decay and something sweeter, like spoiled fruit or old blood gone syrupy. The trees grew twisted, gnarled into unnatural arches. Something skittered in the branches above, too fast to see, too quiet to be beast or bird. And then the forest opened. We stepped into a clearing unlike anything I'd seen. It wasn't made by human hands. The ground was flat and black, slick like stone, but soft like peat. In the center stood a mound, not tall, but wide, like a coiled serpent curled around itself. Its surface pulsed faintly with light, green and sickly. Dozens of bones, human, animal, something else, jutted from the soil in a perfect ring, each one tied with strands of hair and strips of flesh that had somehow not rotted. And atop the mound stood her, the Swamp Priestess. She wasn't what I expected. No hood, no crown of bones, no madness in her eyes. She stood barefoot, wrapped in a robe of woven reeds and moss, her skin pale as candle wax, her hair a nest of thorns and feathers and teeth. Her eyes, they were the worst of it. Black, but not empty. Alive. Watching. She looked young, but she wasn't. You could feel it in the way she moved, slow and deliberate, like the roots beneath her feet shifted with her will. She didn't speak at first. Just studied me like I was some strange carcass she wasn't sure how to carve. Then she smiled. I wondered when you'd come, she said. Her voice was soft, but layered. Like 2 voices speaking in perfect unison, one human, the other not. You know me? I asked. She didn't answer. Just stepped down from the mound and walked barefoot across the black soil toward me. The ground didn't stain her. It opened to her touch like the mire itself obeyed her presence. You carry old blood, she said. Tainted blood. The kind that wakes the sleepers. I didn't come here to wake anything, I said. I came here to disappear. She laughed. Not cruelly worse. Kindly, like a mother hearing her child tell a foolish lie. You carry him, she whispered. The one who broke the pact. You don't even remember, do you? Remember what? But I already knew. She raised a hand and the clearing shifted. Visions. Not memories, not mine, but something older. Something carved into the land itself. I saw a boy running through reeds, clutching something wrapped in cloth. I saw a village on fire. Not Mirebrook, smaller, older. A shrine split in two. A swamp roaring, screaming, alive. And a man, ragged and furious, standing in the mud with a knife made of bone, cutting symbols into his own skin. The swamp answered. It gave him power. Monsters to protect him. Spirits to serve him. But he wanted more. He tried to bind the Mireborn. And failed. I don't know this man, I said, my voice hoarse. You are his echo, she replied. His sin reborn. I shook my head. Lies. Sorcery. Old swamp poison. But something inside me, some buried ache in my chest, stirred. That boy. That shrine. That burning village. It was like a scar I couldn't see had begun to itch. You've been marked since the day you were born, the swamp priestess said. You killed one of the bound. Now the rest stir. The pact has weakened. Then bind them again, I snapped. You're the priestess. Do your damn job. She stepped close, too close, and placed her fingers on my chest. I cannot, she whispered. Only you can. The air thickened. She leaned in, breath hot against my ear. Unless you want every grave in Mirebrook to open. I left the hollow with my head spinning. Theraline said nothing on the way back. She didn't need to. The swamp was watching me now, every root, every insect, every puddle that rippled without wind. The Mireborn were waking, and I become their herald. But one thing stuck with me more than all the rest. Just before I turned away, the swamp priestess called after me. You will have to choose, she said. Who to save, who to bury, and whether you'll stay human when it's done. The hollow swallowed her again, and the swamp began to sing. It began with the sound of bones. Not clashing, not breaking or ringing. Just after midnight, as the village slept in uneasy stillness and the fog crawled like a living thing between shuttered windows, I heard it. A high, brittle chime like wind catching a string of vertebrae. At first, I thought it was just another dream, another curse pressing into my skull. But then I heard it again. And again. A rhythm. A message. A warning. I tore open the shutters and saw it above the chapel. The old bell tower was moving. No one had rung it in years. The bell itself was long removed, its bronze body repurposed by scavengers. But something now swung in its place, a crude chime made of bones. Not decoration. Not art. A summoning. It had been strung together with sinew and twine, crude vertebrae knotted with rotting fetlocks, skulls of birds and beasts dangling like lanterns. Someone had climbed that tower and assembled it. Not recently. The wind howled, and the bell tolled again. I threw on my cloak and stormed into the square, sword half-drawn, breath sharp in my lungs. No one else stirred. Doors were shut, candles dead. Even the dogs had gone silent. Just me, the bell, and the thing that answered it. From the southern edge of the village, the way to the marsh, came a noise I'll never forget. Not a roar. Not a scream. A grinding. Like stone dragged across stone. Like wet bones slithering through dry roots. Then a light, many, blue and flickering like swamp fire, moving low and fast. Shapes followed. I ran. By the time I reached the edge of the marsh, the first corpse was already screaming. He had no face left, only a jaw and the wet pink meat of cheeks peeled back. But he was alive, or half alive, crawling on all fours, mouth stretching wide as a raw moan poured from what was left of his throat. His fingers were broken, twisted backward like claws, and his skin steamed in the moonlight. Behind him, more figures emerged. All wrong. Their limbs bent in strange directions. Some were eyeless, guided only by scent. Others moved as if carried by invisible strings, heads lolling like puppets. One woman, or what had once been a woman, dragged her own intestines behind her like a bridal train. The Mireborn. But not ghosts. Not illusions. These were bodies pulled from graves and swamps and waterlogged holes, reanimated by something crueler than necromancy. These weren't dead brought to life. These were memories brought to flesh. I backed away, heart hammering. Then I saw the boy. The same boy I'd buried with the mother behind the chapel. But now he stood among them, barefoot and silent, his skin caked in grave mold. His eyes were glassy but aware. And he watched me. He raised a hand. And they charged. I've fought in 11 wars. I've killed men in armor, beasts twice my size, and once, in the highlands of Morvac, a thing with no skin that screamed in 3 voices. But nothing prepared me for this. They didn't fight like soldiers. They fought like hunger. No tactics, no fear, no pain. Just relentless momentum, clawing and gnashing and biting. My sword buried itself in chests, necks, spines, but even severed, they kept coming. One leapt onto me, knocking me into the mud. Its face was familiar, Harl's uncle, the old drunk who died last winter, and now his mouth was full of broken teeth, snapping at my throat. I grabbed a bone shard from the ground and drove it into his eye. He didn't scream. He laughed. Blood gushed, hot and dark. But he didn't fall. Theraline's voice cut through the fog, sharp and furious. "Back, you wretches! He bears the mark." She stood atop a low ridge, staff glowing with swamp light, her cloak fluttering like wings. She raised both hands, and from the soil beneath us, black vines erupted. They wrapped around the corpses, tearing arms from sockets, snapping legs like twigs. The Mireborn hissed, not in pain, but in recognition. They knew her, or feared her. The boy didn't move. He just watched as the others were dragged down. And then he smiled. He stepped into the mire and vanished without a ripple. We returned to the chapel. The bell had stopped ringing, but the sound still echoed in my skull. Theraline was pale, shaken. "That wasn't them," she said. "Not the real Mireborn. That was something older. A piece of what's coming." I asked what the hell the bone bell was. She hesitated. "Then it's part of the Pact. The first warning. When it tolls, it means the boundary's breaking. They're not trapped anymore. They're remembering how to cross." She looked me dead in the eye. "And they're looking for you." I didn't answer. Couldn't. My hands were still trembling, slick with black blood. In the far room of the chapel, the old priest stirred. I hadn't seen him in days. He'd refused to come out since the last grave split. But now he appeared, a gaunt wraith of a man, his robes stained and his eyes wide with horror. He held something in his hands. A book, bound in leather I didn't recognize, its cover carved with glyphs that seemed to shift when I looked too long. He placed it on the altar without a word, then knelt and whispered, "We broke it. We broke the pact. And now they'll take him. The one who carries the echo." He looked up at me. "Unless you offer yourself first." Later, in the quiet, I opened the book. Its pages smelled of rot and seawater. But the words were old. Older than the church. Older than the village. And they told a tale I knew too well. A boy who ran from fire. A pact broken in the dark. And a voice in the swamp that whispered through generations, binding its hunger in the name of safety. The final page was blank. Waiting to be written. Waiting for me. No sane man goes below Mirebrook. That's what they say, and they're not wrong. Beneath the mud and the rotted wood and the pale reeds lies something older than the village, older than the chapel, older than names. I'd heard the stories when I first arrived, passed between drunk lips at dusk, of tunnels carved not by hand but by hunger, of roots that bleed when cut, of voices that echo where no walls stand. Stories of salt and rot and something deeper still. But that night, after the bell rang, after the dead rose and called my name, I knew I had no choice. The answers weren't in the chapel, not in the priest's book. Not even in the hollow. They were buried, and I was going to dig. Theraline tried to stop me. Not with force, she knew better, but with words. She caught me packing, strapping blades to my thigh, binding the last of my clean bandages, and she stood in the doorway like a statue carved from grief. "You don't come back from down there," she said. "I don't think I'm supposed to." She stepped forward. Her voice was soft. "I've lived here all my life. My mother did too, and her mother before that. Every few decades, something starts to stir. Graves open. Winds talk. People vanish. And always, someone goes down to the salt chambers thinking they'll stop it." I looked at her. "They don't come back, do they?" She shook her head. "Then maybe they were looking in the wrong place." I left her in silence. "There's a place south of Mirebrook where the swamp sags like a dying lung. Locals call it the Vein. A long, narrow trench choked with black moss and ghost lights. No birds. No frogs. Just silence and a smell like old iron. I climbed down into it. My boots sank deep, past water and muck into something gritty salt. The whole floor of the vein was coated in it. Not like seasoning. Like sediment. As if something down there had boiled and bled until the mire itself remembered. I followed the salt trail to the center of the trench where a single stone jutted from the earth like a fawn. A crude altar. Cracked and half swallowed by vines. Carved into its face was the sigil I'd seen in the book, a spiral of roots with a line of salt cutting through it. The glyph shimmered faintly in the dark, pulsing like breath. I placed my hand on it. It was cold. So cold it burned. And the earth beneath me opened. It wasn't an explosion. Not magic. Not wind. Just a slow, grinding shift. Like doors made of bone creaking open in the dark. The altar slid aside with a sound like sobbing stone, revealing a stair of twisted roots slick with brine. I descended, and the swamp closed behind me. The air below was wrong. Thick, yes. Wet, yes. But more than that, it hummed. Every breath felt borrowed. Every heartbeat echoed like a drum in a tomb. The walls were narrow, formed not of stone but of tangled roots grown over centuries, each pulsating faintly with black-green sap. The deeper I went, the more I felt it. The pact. It was etched into the walls, burned into the very marrow of this place. Not with words, but with symbols. Glyphs older than runes. Spirals. Claws. Eyes. Salt lines. I didn't understand them, not fully, but they knew me. And I knew them. After what felt like hours, the roots opened into a chamber. Massive. Hollow. A cathedral beneath the earth. It wasn't empty. At the center lay a pool of liquid that shimmered like glass, not water. Not blood. Something between. Suspended in it, hanging motionless, was a corpse. No, not a corpse. A vessel. A body carved with runes, its flesh stitched shut along every joint. Its eyes were gone, sockets filled with salt. From its mouth, strands of root emerged like breath. And all around it, bones, hundreds, thousands, forming a ring of offerings. This was no shrine. This was a prison. I stepped closer, and the runes on the corpse began to glow. A voice filled the chamber, but not through ears. Through bone. You were his echo. The voice was not male or female. It was many, whispering in unison. You carry the guilt, the sin, the breach. You are the price unpaid. I fell to my knees, not from fear, from recognition. I saw it again. The boy, the pact, the fire. But this time I saw his face. Mine. It wasn't a memory, not a dream, not magic. It was blood. My blood. I was the boy, the one who had broken the pact. Not a descendant, not a victim. I hadn't inherited the curse. I had started it. The swamp hadn't called me to fix anything. It had called me to finish what I began. I don't know how long I sat there. Could have been hours. Could have been days. The chamber had no time. Just silence and breath and the slow sound of salt falling like snow. But eventually I rose. My hands trembled. My heart burned. And I made a choice. I placed my palm against the vessel's chest. The runes flared. The salt cracked. And the body opened. What came out wasn't human. It was shape and hunger and voice and memory. It flowed like water, like smoke, like grief made flesh. It didn't attack me. It entered me. Not to possess. To return. We had been one once. And now we were again. The pact wasn't a chain. It was a seal. And I had just broken it. I don't remember the climb back. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe the mire gave me back like a swallowed seed, spat out only after it had taken root. One moment I stood in that impossible chamber beneath the salt-veined earth, shivering with something older than terror, my hands still wet from the chest of that vessel. The next, I was lying face up in the mud at the edge of the vein, eyes wide open, breathing fog into the dying dusk. The wind had changed. I could taste it on my tongue, copper and ash, like the breath of something that had slept too long and dreamed of teeth. My skin burned. Not like fire. Like memory. Every scar I had earned in this life and the one before it had reopened, not bleeding, but aching. Each throb was a name. Each pulse a sin. I reached beneath my shirt and pulled the fabric away from my chest, and there, across my ribs and collar and stomach, the runes had appeared, branded into me as if burned there by the pact itself. They weren't decorative. They weren't symbols. They were words. And they whispered. Not aloud, no. The voice was in the muscle, in the marrow. My skin spoke, and I was forced to listen. Every breath was layered with a sound just behind the sound, a voice that matched mine in cadence and rhythm, but held a tone I had never used, a crueler version, dry and ancient, as if every word I uttered dragged a nail across the inside of a coffin. I staggered into the trees. The village lights danced between the trunks like will-o'-the-wisps, but they weren't warm. They weren't welcoming. Something had changed, not just in me, but in them. The air tasted tighter. The branches of the trees bowed not toward the wind, but away from me, recoiling. Animals scattered in my wake. The night itself held its breath. And then I saw her. Theraline stood at the edge of the hollow, barefoot in the mud, hair wild and loose like a morning veil. Her eyes fixed on me as I emerged, but she didn't flinch, not at first. She just watched, unmoving, lips tight. The way a woman watches a man returning from war, not sure if it's truly him or just the ghost in his skin. You're not the same, she said, quiet. I opened my mouth to reply, but the voice that came out was not mine. It was mine. And something more. It layered over itself. Echoed even in silence. I remember everything I said. Or it said. Or we said. She took a step back. Then it's too late. The chapel was full by the time we arrived. I didn't walk through the village. I cut through it, a presence, a ripple in the world. The villagers, those that still dared to stand in the square, parted like wheat before the scythe. Some bowed their heads. Others fell to their knees in prayer or fear. One child screamed and ran back into a home, and I felt the scream all the way down to the roots of my new self. Inside the chapel, the priest waited. Or what remained of him. He was thinner now, as if the rot had begun to claim him. His hands shook. His eyes had gone white, not blind, just empty, as if whatever part of him could fear had already burned away. In front of him lay the book of the Pact. It lay open, its pages fluttering though there was no wind. The last page was still blank, still waiting. "You should not have returned," he whispered. "You should have died down there." I approached the altar. I could feel the wood wince beneath my touch, as if the grain itself feared being touched by something born of the mire. I opened the book wider, ran my fingers along the margins. "The pact wasn't just broken," I said. "It was incomplete." He nodded. "A sacrifice must be made. The body must contain the voice." I looked down at myself and laughed. "It already does." That night, the swamp moved. I felt it as I stood atop the bell tower, looking out beyond the fog. The trees shifted, not from wind, but will. The roots of the mire pulled inward, coiling around the bones of the world. And the dead came walking, not just from the southern fields this time, from every direction. Old bones rose from flooded graves. Creatures that had never known daylight slithered from black pools, their skin made of bark and rot and old, bitter memories. The village was surrounded, and I understood. They weren't here to kill. They were here to claim. The Mireborn had followed the echo. They had waited centuries for the seal to weaken. They had lingered in root and dream and blood. And now their voice had returned. They had returned to me. Theraline stood beside me, silent. She did not beg. She did not run. She looked at me and asked only one question: "What are you going to do?" And I answered honestly, "I don't know yet," because I could feel it even then, the pull. The swamp wanted me, not as a king, not as a vessel, as a bridge, between man and memory, between pact and punishment, between the old ways and the blood yet to come. The runes on my skin had stopped whispering now. They were waiting for a decision. And in the silence of the mire, with the bones of the dead gathering, I knew that choice would come soon. But not tonight. Tonight, I would sleep and dream with both voices in my chest. I awoke to breath that was not mine. It filled the room like fog, slow and heavy, rising from the corners, sliding along the stone as if the chapel itself exhaled after centuries of silence. The bed I'd taken in the bell tower hadn't been slept in for years. It smelled of mold and soot, but it held me through the night like an open grave holds the dead, firm, still, unforgiving. I sat up slowly. My limbs ached, not from fatigue but from growth, like something new had settled beneath the skin and stretched during sleep. The runes along my chest and arms still pulsed softly, dim now, like dying embers. Waiting. Watching. I heard no birds. No wind. Only the steady sound of breathing. It came from below. From beneath the chapel, beneath the dirt, beneath the graves, dozens, maybe hundreds of them stacked in rows behind the chapel yard. Old graves most long forgotten. I had seen them on the first day I arrived, before the bells, before the pact began to stir. Back then, they were just mounds of earth and moss-covered stones. Now they moved. I crossed the threshold of the chapel and stepped out into a dawn smeared with gray. The sun didn't rise that morning. It simply appeared, weak and pale, barely burning through the low fog that clung to the trees like the hands of drowned men. The village square was empty. Not silent, not lifeless, but empty in that way a battlefield feels just before the charge, coiled with tension, every shadow a threat. And then I saw them. The graves. They had risen. Not just the dead, though they came too, but the soil itself. The mounds had split open, and from each something had bloomed. Not flowers, not trees, but growths like pale fungi, ribbed and veined, slick with moisture. They pulsed in time with the breath I had heard, expanding and contracting as if inhaling the very fog that choked the air. Some had shapes like hearts. Others looked like coiled limbs, or lungs, or teeth. It wasn't nature. It was memory made flesh. The swamp remembering its pact. I approached one of the graves, the oldest, marked only with a stone etched in spirals. It had cracked wide, revealing not a coffin, but a pit. And within, curled like a babe in the womb, was a figure. Not quite human. Not quite beast. Its skin was translucent, stretched over a skeleton far too large for its frame. It had no eyes, just salt-filled sockets and a lipless mouth filled with jagged shards of bone. Its hands clawed at the soil around it, not to escape, but to anchor itself, to stay, to root. It was breathing, softly, in rhythm with the others. They were waiting, not to rise, not to hunt, to be claimed. That was the moment I understood the pact wasn't a curse. It wasn't punishment. It was inheritance. The swamp had never wanted to kill the villagers. It had wanted to join them. Every few decades, when the bloodline thinned, when the memory faded, the pact would stir. It would take, remind, reclaim. And now it had me. The echo, The breach. The bridge. I had reawakened what had been sleeping, and it was offering itself to me. Not as a servant. As kin. The graves were breathing because they recognized me. And I recognized them too. I turned from the graves and walked through the village, my presence drawing doors shut, candles snuffed, prayers muttered behind cracked shutters. Only one dared meet my gaze. A boy. No older than 10. Mud-streaked. Barefoot. He stood beside a well, clutching a wooden figure in his hands, a toy carved from swampwood. A hunter. Its spear had snapped. I stopped. He didn't flinch. He looked at me like a starving dog looks at a butcher, uncertain whether to fear or follow. I crouched beside him. "What's your name?" He didn't answer, just held out the figure. It had my face, the beard, the scar, the hollow eyes. I took it from him gently. Its weight surprised me. Not wood. Bone. Carved, shaped, painted, but undeniably bone. I looked back at the boy. His eyes were rimmed with red. "My father carved it," he whispered, "before they took him." "Who took him?" He looked toward the swamp. Then at me. "You did." I didn't answer. Couldn't. Because he was right. If not me, then the thing I had woken. The thing that was me. I had brought this. Reopened old wounds. Torn open old graves. And the village would never forgive me. But they might survive. If I chose right. By dusk, the chapel was full again. The priest was gone. Fled? Taken? I didn't ask. Only Theraline remained, and a handful of villagers, those too stubborn or broken to run. The boy sat beside her, clutching the figure. I stood before them, and I spoke. "I was not born here," I said, "but I am of here. By pact. By blood. I broke what should not have been broken, and now I carry it." They said nothing, only stared. "I do not come to save you. There is no saving. Only choice. You can flee and die slowly, or stay and be remembered." I pulled the blade from my belt, not to threaten. To offer. To bind the swamp, it must know our names. I placed the blade on the altar, then turned my back, and waited. The first to rise was the boy. He stepped forward, took the blade, and cut his palm. Blood hit the altar like a whisper, and the runes sang. The blood didn't drip, it crawled. As the boy's cut hand hovered over the altar, each drop moved with slow, unnatural purpose, threads of red weaving like silk across the old wood, slithering into the grooves and worn patterns carved long before this chapel ever stood. The altar didn't absorb the blood. It fed on it, glowing faintly with a color I couldn't name, a light that wasn't light, more like the memory of fire. I watched in silence as the blade passed from hand to hand, the villagers stepping forward not with fear, but with grim resolve, each one slicing their palm and letting a part of themselves enter the pact. And I did nothing to stop them, because I couldn't. Not anymore. The choice had never truly been mine. The moment I touched the sigil stone beneath the vein, when the salt filled my mouth and the voice slithered into my marrow, I became something between. I carried the old pact in my blood now. It guided my hands even when I thought I acted of my own will. The Mireborn didn't force, no, they remembered. They echoed, and they were echoing through me now. When Theraline took the blade, she hesitated. Her eyes locked with mine, deep and uncertain. Her hands didn't tremble, not yet, but I could see the weight in her breath. Unlike the others, she hadn't been born here. She came to this village 10 winters ago, fleeing a war that had left her husband in pieces and her child in ash. She had made a life among strangers, earning respect through sweat and silence, never asking for kindness and never offering pity. But she chose to stay, chose to believe in the pact, even when it killed her crops, even when it took her sister in the last culling. I remembered her face then, gaunt and unmoving, watching the pyres burn. "I don't know what this means anymore," she whispered to me. "Neither do I said. But still, she cut. And when her blood struck the altar, the chapel shook. Only slightly. A pulse. A breath. The swamp had begun to answer. We left the chapel as one, silent, marked, and uncertain. The sky above us had shifted to that sickly gray that came before a storm, and the trees of the mire leaned toward the village as if listening. I could feel the tension beneath the soil, a pressure building like air trapped in lungs too long held. The runes on my skin began to glow again, soft, warm, a warning. They were waking. They felt the change. This new bond, it wasn't what they remembered. It wasn't sacrifice. It was choice. And they didn't know how to react. I told the others to prepare. Not for war. Not yet. But for something worse, judgment. That night, I returned alone to the vein. The path down was easier this time. Not because the earth had changed, but because I had. The roots no longer fought me. The shadows moved aside. Even the bones piled and scattered across the wet stone path no longer reached for me in their hunger. They watched. They listened. Some even whispered in the language I was beginning to understand, a tongue made of memory and salt and grief. As I descended deeper, the runes on my chest began to burn hotter, reacting to the pressure of the place until they glowed like fire beneath my skin. At the bottom, the salt chamber was waiting. It was larger now somehow, or perhaps I could see it more clearly. Its walls pulsed like the inside of a living lung, wet and slick with condensation. The stone altar at its center remained unchanged, but around it now stood the figures, the ones I had seen before, only now they moved. Shifting, watching, not ghosts, not spirits, but something else. Projections of the Pact, fragments of all those who had borne it before me. And one of them stepped forward. He was tall, emaciated, skin stretched tight over a frame that seemed neither living nor dead. His eyes were hollow, his mouth stitched shut, but his voice came from within me. You bring them. Yes, I said. You change the words. I rewrite them. You challenge the Pact. I continue it. A long silence followed. And then they moved, all of them, dozens of shades stepping forward, surrounding me in a circle, their fingers raised, pointing not at me, but at the altar. Then prove it, the voice said. I stepped forward. I placed both my hands on the cold stone, and instantly the runes on my arms bled light into the altar. The chamber shook again, more violently now, and above me, in the world I had left behind, I could feel the swamp reacting, roots splitting, fog thickening, something vast beginning to rise from its long slumber. A scream echoed through the chamber, sharp and distant. It wasn't pain. It was recognition. And then the altar split, cracked clean down the middle, revealing beneath it not a relic or a weapon, but a pit. A narrow shaft that descended into darkness deeper than I could comprehend. The voice returned, stronger now. Descend. I hesitated. This was not part of the original pact. This wasn't sacrifice or prayer. This was something older, deeper. But I had already rewritten the terms. So I climbed in. There was no ladder, just walls of flesh and stone and old, damp memory. I fell more than I climbed, sliding down until I landed hard in a chamber unlike any I had seen. No light, no air, only presence. And there in the dark, something moved. Not toward me, around me. It was huge, shifting, breathing, whispering. It didn't speak in words. It spoke in memory. My mother's voice, my father's blade, the scream of the man I killed in a raid long ago. The crying of the boy with the carved bone figure, the silence of the villagers as they gave their blood. It spoke with all of them. It was them. It was the Pact. And it asked, will you carry us still? I thought of the graves, of the swamp, of the breathing dead and the boy who trusted me even as he feared me. And I answered not with words, but with blood. I pressed my hand against the pulsing wall and let it in. Let all of it in. And when I rose again from the pit, I wasn't alone. They rose with me. The swamp moved that night. Not in storm or flood, but in form, as if the very soil beneath our feet had chosen to stretch its limbs and rise with purpose. It began as a vibration, faint and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth had returned after centuries of stillness. I stood at the edge of the village, fresh from the salt vein's maw, the blood on my hands still warm, my chest scorched with rune light that had not dimmed since I emerged. I no longer walked like a man. I could feel it. Something had taken root in my spine, in my bones, in the shadow behind my eyes. My voice still sounded like my own when I spoke aloud, but I could sense other voices rising beneath it, like a choir submerged under water. Echoes of the Pact, memories of every soul who had ever bled for this land. And I, by choice, by consequence, had become their vessel. Theraline saw it the moment she laid eyes on me. I stepped into the chapel where they waited, where the altar still bore the crimson of our covenant, and she rose from the pew as though watching an old ghost come home. Her hair, damp with sweat, clung to her temples. The boy clutched her hand but did not flinch. His eyes were locked on me, wary yes but curious. His innocence was still intact, like a flame cupped in shaking palms. I envied him for that. They've stirred, I said, my voice deeper than it had been, rasped with something ancient. They're awake, and they're coming. Coming? She asked. From where? I didn't answer, because they weren't coming from the swamp. They were coming through it. We heard the first scream just past midnight. A sharp cry from the east fields, near the old mill that hadn't turned in 2 winters. A voice high and panicked. cut short by something wet and final. I ran without waiting for the others, my feet moving faster than breath, the runes across my skin trailing wisps of greenish fire that hissed against the night. When I reached the field, I saw them. 3 figures, hunched low in the grass, moving with the twitchy grace of something that remembered walking but had forgotten how to stop. Their limbs were stretched and uneven, their flesh glistening with slime, not rotted but new, as if freshly birthed from the mud. Their faces were almost human, almost, but their mouths opened too wide, and their eyes, those bulbous, sightless pits, glowed with the same dull light as my own sigils. I didn't draw my blade. I didn't need to. They stopped when they saw me, lifting their heads like dogs catching a scent. Then, as one, they bowed. They weren't attacking. They were answering. I approached the nearest of them, wary but unafraid. Up close, the creature's skin rippled like pond water, constantly shifting between shapes, man, beast, woman, child, as though trying to remember who it once was. Its chest bore a mark, a rune I recognized. It was the symbol of the altar, carved in raised flesh like a blister. It was one of ours, someone from the village, reborn. I reached out and touched its face, and the moment my fingers met its skin, a flood of memory surged into me. Images, smells, sounds. A man, elderly, beekeeper. He had bled at the altar 3 nights ago, one of the quiet ones who never spoke. His body had died in his sleep, but something else had awakened in its place. They weren't dead, not in the way the old stories warned us. The Pact had found new form. It wasn't a spirit or monster. It was continuance. The swamp was learning how to walk among us again. When I returned to the village, I did not return alone. The 3 followed me, silent and obedient, like shadows that had chosen flesh. Panic swept the square. Villagers fled indoors, some cried, others shouted. Some raised old tools like they could ward off this transformation with rust and memory. But I stood in the center, my hands raised, the runes along my chest casting a light that held back the fog. "They are not here to harm you," I said. "They are you." That did not comfort them. "Then why do they look like monsters?" one of them yelled. A woman I remembered from the chapel. She had not bled. Her eyes brimmed with fear and fury. "Because you expect them to," I said. And that was the truth. The Pact had returned in the only form it was allowed. The only form we had made room for. In our fear, we had given it teeth and claws. And now it wore them like a cloak. But it could change. If we changed. That night, the swamp crept closer. Not with force. With invitation. Roots burst gently from the ground near the well, curling around the stone like fingers in prayer. Trees bent toward the houses but did not shatter them. Fog thickened, not to blind, but to hide the old world, the one that had failed. This new world wanted something different. It didn't want to destroy the village. It wanted to merge with it, become part of it again. A cycle, but balance required sacrifice. And the swamp, for all its hunger, respected that. So it offered a choice. We gathered in the chapel, every soul who dared. Theraline stood by my side. The boy clutched his bone-carved figure. Outside, the reformed ones, neither living nor dead, watched from the mist. I spoke plainly. The Mireborn have returned, not to take, to become. But they need hosts, willing ones. They won't force you. But the world outside this mire will not come to save us. It never has. We are our own salvation now. Silence. Then, one by one, they stood. Not all, but enough. Enough to reshape what this place would become. The next morning, the first transformation began. Theraline was the first. She took my hand, stepped into the swamp with me, and let the roots claim her. It was not death. It was becoming. Her form dissolved and reformed before my eyes. Not twisted, not grotesque. Beautiful, ethereal. Her skin shimmered like wet bark. Her hair became reeds, her eyes dark mirrors. And she smiled, for the first time in years. The Mireborn Pact had rewritten itself. It no longer asked for blood, only remembrance. And for those willing to carry it, the swamp offered not destruction, but eternity. There is something uniquely terrifying about silence when you know it's hiding a scream. The village wore that silence now. Not peace, not calm, but the heavy breath held before a knife drops. I could feel it in the air, thick with moisture and suspicion. The people who had accepted the pact, the ones who had let the swamp mark them, fill them, twist them, moved with purpose. Changed, yes, but whole in ways they had never been before. I watched them walking through the fog with moss-wrapped limbs and breath that misted green, laughing low, gathering reeds and firewood, speaking in tongues half familiar and half mire. But the others, the ones who had refused, they watched from behind shutters, from under floorboards, from high lofts with eyes narrowed and hands clenched around rusted blades. I knew it wouldn't hold. Not forever. Not after what happened to Elrin's boy. It was near dawn when I found the body, half buried beneath a blanket of peat by the southern fence. His limbs curled in upon themselves as if death had caught him mid-prayer. No wound, no blood, just stillness, as if the swamp had merely asked him to stop and he'd obeyed, quietly, without protest. The look on his face was the worst of it, calm, content, not terror but release. A child no more than 12. His father, Elrin, found me there, crouched over the boy's body, brushing peat from his brow. And he did what all men do when grief has nowhere else to go. He blamed. "You did this?" He spat. And for the first time in days, I saw hate again. Not fear, not confusion, pure white-hot hatred. You and your walking monsters. You promised no harm would come. I rose slowly, and the wind carried the scent of salt through the broken reeds. "I made no promises," I said. "Only choices. Then this is your answer?" He didn't choose. He was a child, and the swamp chose him. He lunged at me then, knife drawn, blade sharp from a whetstone long and used. I let him come. He needed to. He needed to burn it out of his chest. His blade kissed my shoulder and split flesh, but no blood spilled. The runes absorbed it, glowing hot, and when he saw the light crawl across my skin, he froze. "I'm not what I was," I told him. "But neither are you." He stumbled back, and he ran. That night, I stood in the center of the village and lit no fire. Let the dark see me clearly. I called out not to the Pact-born, not to the swamp, but to the others. The ones hiding. The ones still waiting for the world to go back to how it was. The ones who still believed they were unmarked. "You think death only comes in claws and rot," I said. "But it also comes in choices unmade. The world outside will not come. No king will ride in on white horse. No gods will part the sky. There is only this land, this mire, this pact. And if you do not choose, it will choose for you." They did not answer me, but they heard. I felt them shift behind windows. Graves were rising, and no one had carved names into them. Later, in the chapel, I found Theraline kneeling in prayer. Her form had changed further, her legs no longer legs, but woven root and bone. Her back was curved like a tree learning to walk, yet her eyes were still hers. She smiled when she saw me. "They're scared," she said. "They should be. They think you're becoming the enemy." "I am." She tilted her head. "Are you?" I didn't answer. The rebellion began 2 nights later. It was small, desperate, clumsy. Exactly how all rebellions begin. A group of 7, led by Elrin, armed with pitchforks, axes, and old steel that hadn't tasted blood in decades. They waited until the pack-bound were sleeping, if we even did sleep anymore, and then struck the homes closest to the chapel. One of the swamp-touched, Vessa, the baker's daughter, who now sang to the water each morning, was dragged from her bed and burned behind the mill. I smelled the smoke before I saw the flames. By the time I arrived, they had already moved on to the next house. And I didn't speak. I acted. I called the mire. Came like a scream through the roots. The ground pulsed and split. Fog turned to fingers and wrapped around their throats. Trees bent low, groaning like wounded beasts, their branches tearing through air and bone. The rebellion ended in heartbeats. Of the 7, only 2 survived. I spared them not out of mercy, but purpose. I wanted them to carry the memory of what defiance looked like in this new world. Let them become the warnings carved into bark and whispered in dream. I buried the dead, even Vesa, even Elrin. I buried them in unmarked graves, because no name matters when the swamp remembers you. That night, I sat alone in the chapel, the roots of the mire curling around my boots, growing through the cracks in the floor. I listened to the silence again. Not fear this time, grief, transformation, the slow, grinding wheels of change. I whispered a prayer I did not understand, and the swamp whispered back. The first time I dreamt with the swamp, it was not sleep as I once knew it. There was no line between where I ended and the mire began, no veil to lift, no plunge into unconsciousness. Instead, I felt the world around me exhale, and my breath simply followed. The roots that had begun to curl through the chapel floor now wound gently around my ankles, not with force, but with intent, like a lover's fingers in the dark. I did not resist. I closed my eyes not to drift into slumber, but to see what waited behind the lids. The swamp was calling me into itself, not just to walk it, not just to speak through it, but to become it. And in that breathless silence, I fell into a vision. It was not a memory. It was not a future. It was the dream of something that remembered being everything and feared becoming nothing. I stood in a swamp not unlike the one I knew, but ancient, untouched by the hand of man. The trees were impossibly tall, crowned in shadow, their trunks wide enough to house entire lives. The sky was blood dark and heavy with stars that pulsed like dying hearts. There were no birds, no wind, only the hum of the earth beneath, vibrating through my feet like a warning. Or a welcome. A figure moved through the mire toward me, and though its face was cloaked in writhing moss and its limbs too long to be human, I knew it. Not by name, for it had none, but by presence. It was the first dreamer, the one who had spoken the original pact, the one who had bled not for survival, but for remembrance. It spoke without mouth or sound, the words bleeding directly into my mind like roots sinking into soft mud. Do you know what you become? I tried to answer. My voice did not carry. My thoughts felt naked under its gaze. You wear the gift like armor, it whispered, but you forget it was never meant to protect. It was meant to preserve. I saw visions then, blinding flashes of time before time. Tribes kneeling before sacred bogs. Women singing into the waters as the moon bled red. Men casting their own eyes into the mire to see beyond the veil. I saw children born with gills, with bark spines, with voices like rain. I saw fire not from invaders, but from within. I saw the pact broken, and the swamp falling into silence. You are not the first, it said, but you may be the last. I awoke gasping. The chapel was dark, but not empty. Theraline was there, seated beside me, her root fingers interwoven with mine. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dimness, and though her face was becoming more mire than mortal, her presence soothed the terror that clung to my ribs. You saw it, she said. Yes. It showed me too. Long ago. Before I gave myself. I looked at her, really looked. Her cheeks bore tiny buds now, as if flowers would bloom from her skin with the next breath of spring. Her voice still carried the warmth I remembered from the days before everything changed, but now it echoed with something deeper, something old. What happens if we fail? I asked. She didn't speak. She only squeezed my hand. I left the chapel before dawn and wandered deep into the woods where the fog grew too thick for light to pass. I walked not with feet, but with memory drawn to something I did not yet understand. The mire whispered to me, not in words but desires. It tugged at my marrow, guiding me toward the heart of itself, toward the buried truth. I found the pit at the end of the world, a crater in the earth ringed by stones carved in runes so old even the Pact-born would not read them. The roots here were blackened and charred as if scorched by flame that did not burn. I stepped into the pit and the earth welcomed me. Beneath the moss, I found bones. Dozens, hundreds, twisted, unnatural, some shaped like men, others like beasts, others still like nothing I could name. And among them, one thing that did not belong, a blade. Metal. Forged. Rusted with time, but humming with latent heat. I reached for it, and the swamp screamed. It was not fear. It was rage. I fell to my knees, head splitting with images I could not control. War, betrayal, fire licking through the trees, pact bearers turning on their own, a king with silver eyes striking down the first dreamer with the very sword I now held. I let go, and the mire recoiled as if burned. This was no offering. This was a relic of the breaking. A memory buried not to preserve, but to forget. And I had unearthed it. When I returned to the village, the fog had turned thick and sour. The Pact-born looked at me with unease. Some stepped back. Others bowed low, their voices chanting things I no longer understood. The line between worship and warning had blurred. I hid the blade, wrapped in cloth beneath the altar where the runes would dim its scent. Theraline found me there hours later, her body now almost entirely transformed, only her eyes remaining untouched by the mire. "You've brought something dangerous," she said. "It found me. Then it remembers you." We stood in silence, the roots pulsing around us like veins. "I think we were meant to fail," I whispered. "No," she said. "We were meant to choose. The swamp dreams, but it also remembers. And not all memories are kind. There are truths buried beneath the mire that should never be unearthed. But I had found one. And now the swamp was watching, waiting, to see what I would do next. It began with dreams that weren't mine. I would close my eyes only for the shadows to pull me elsewhere, into another skin, another voice, another era where the trees stood younger and the mire did not yet hum with its broken heartbeat. I saw through the eyes of a man who walked with such regal certainty that even the earth seemed to bow to his passing. His armor was not made of iron, but of dark plates carved from obsidian-veined stone, etched in symbols I had come to recognize from the old roots. But what struck me most were his eyes, silver, cold, mirror-like. They did not blink. They did not weep. They reflected everything and revealed nothing. He walked through the very land I now guarded, but it was not the same. The mire was thinner than a series of shallow waters and thick copses. There were no Pact-born, no swamp-touched. There were only tribes, simple, old blood tribes, kneeling around the water, their hands outstretched in reverence. I could hear their chants, ancient syllables that brushed against my own thoughts like vines wrapping gently around a wrist. And in the dream, I know, he watched them with a heart full of something that might have once been awe. But awe turned quickly to disgust. I saw what he did. The silver-eyed king. He called himself that not by name, but by destiny. A child of the stars, he claimed, born of flame and flesh, destined to burn the rot from the world and raise a new kingdom on its ashes. And to him, the swamp, the living, dreaming, breathing mire, was nothing more than a parasite clinging to the skin of his vision. He marched with soldiers who bore no sigils, only burnished metal masks, each shaped in twisted mimicry of forgotten gods. They came not to conquer, but to cleanse. He did not make war on the tribes. He made war on the land. The dream shifted then, like a page being torn mid-sentence. I stood in the pit again, the pit I had found days before, where the blade had slept in its bed of bones. But this time it was no ruin. It was a place of ceremony. And the first dreamer stood at its center. She was tall. Taller than any woman I'd known, her body draped in moss and bone, her hair woven with strands of light that did not belong to this world. Her eyes glowed not green like the swamp's children, but a deep, infinite gold like the last ray of sun before the world ends. She spoke words that cracked the air like thunder. And the roots moved. The earth rebelled. But it wasn't enough. I watched the silver-eyed king lift the blade. That same blade I had unearthed, sleek and hungry, forged not in fire but in will. A weapon made not to kill flesh but to sever soul from earth. And he struck. The first dreamer did not fall like a woman. She broke like a mountain. The pit screamed. The land cried out. And the pact, old, sacred, eternal, was shattered in an instant. The swamp recoiled. It died just a little, but it never forgot. When I awoke, the blade was in my hand. I had not moved. I had not touched it since the day I buried it beneath the altar. But now it lay across my palms as if summoned. Cold, waiting. And worse, it hummed. Not with magic, with memory. Theraline stood in the doorway. She did not look surprised. "You saw him," she said. "The silver-eyed king." She nodded slowly. "He wasn't born of the mire. He came from the stars, or so he claimed. I've heard his name whispered in my dreams. Valen." I turned the blade slowly, the edge catching faint light that had no source. Why show me now? Because the swamp knows you are close to doing what he did. And it fears you. The words struck deeper than I wanted to admit. Because in my bones, I knew she was right. The village had changed. The divide between those who had accepted the pact and those who still clung to their former selves had grown deeper, wider. Lines were being drawn not in blood but in silence, in stares, in half-spoken warnings over water buckets and shared meals. And I, caught between what I was and what I was becoming, could feel the blade's presence like a heartbeat pressed to my spine. That night, I took it to the edge of the mire. Alone. I stood where the trees were gnarled and old, where the roots curled above the ground like veins bursting through skin. I raised the blade. Not to strike. Not to threaten. But to offer. "If you fear this," I said aloud, "then take it." The wind did not answer. The swamp did not move. So I drove it into the soil. Deep. As deep as it would go. And the ground shook. Visions came not in sleep, but while I was still awake. Glimpses. Bursts. I saw the first dreamer's death again and again, her golden eyes fading into dark. I saw Valen, crowned in flame, standing over the broken pact. I saw the tribes torn asunder. And I saw the same fate mirrored in our time. The blade drawn again. The choice repeated. Only this time, I was the one holding it, not out of hunger, but out of fear. I returned to the chapel to find it empty. Theraline was gone. In her place, on the stone altar, lay a single flower, black as pitch, pulsing faintly with breath. A seed from the deep mire. A sign. And etched beside it, carved in fresh root, he walks again. The silver-eyed king had died once. But perhaps kings like him never truly die. Perhaps, through blade or memory, they simply wait. And now the mire was stirring, not with hope, but warning. A reckoning was coming. And I wasn't sure if I'd be its savior or its mirror. The rot did not announce itself with decay. It crept in quietly, not as a stench, but as a silence, as if something sacred had stopped breathing. I noticed it first in the outer pools, shallow basins I'd known since my first step into this god-cursed swamp. Waters that once pulsed with green light now stood still and gray, their surfaces glassy and unmoving, untouched by insects or wind. The lilies that had floated in clusters like tiny votives were gone, petals curled inward like fists. The frogs, once the constant chorus of the night, had vanished, their absence more deafening than their croaks had ever been. And the roots, those eternal veins of the mire, trembled faintly beneath my boots, not with life, but with dread. Something had pierced the dream. Something unnatural. I followed the signs deeper, past the known paths, beyond the whispers of pact-born children who now watched me with hollow eyes and half-grown bark where skin used to be. They were afraid, though none dared say it. Fear was sacred here, it belonged to the swamp, not to them. And yet even the elders, those whose voices had long since turned to mulch and memory, stayed close to the fire now. Close to each other. I'd never seen the Mire's chosen seek warmth. But something had shifted, and that shift left them cold. Then came the afflictions. It started with Myron, a boy of 13 seasons, whose transformation had once been a source of quiet pride. His skin had taken on the soft lichen gray of bonded bark, and his fingers had begun to root when he slept, gentle filaments that curled into the wood of his bed like fingers into his mother's palm. But now he thrashed. His roots bled black, and his voice, once sweet and high, came out broken, as if splintered through glass. He screamed not in pain, but in confusion, begging the swamp to speak, to soothe him, to tell him it hadn't abandoned him. But there was no answer. Then others began to fall. 2 elders collapsed during the binding chant. A woman's arm shriveled mid-growth, the bark blackening, flaking away into ash. Even Theraline's absence took on a darker weight. She had not just wandered. She had fled, and now I understood why. The swamp wasn't just weakening. It was failing, retreating, and something else was moving into the hollow it left behind. I remembered the blade, how it had hummed with memory, how the swamp had recoiled when I unearthed it. And now I felt that same hum, not from the weapon, but from the air itself. As if the memory had leaked into the mire, corrupted its dreaming, replaced its voice with something colder. It wasn't just the return of Valen I feared, it was his ideology, his certainty, his belief that the world must be purified and that anything organic, fluid, or dreaming stood in the way. I knew then what I had to do. I had to find the last remnant of the first dreamer's line. The guardian, the sleeper, the one they called Morinth. Morinth was legend. Not pact-born, not swamp-bound, but something older, a hybrid of 2 truths long thought to be opposed. Born of pact and blood, blessed by the dreamer, exiled by the king. It was said she slept at the edge of the deep mire where no one dared go, where even the pact could not follow. A place where roots were bone-white and the trees hung their branches like gallows. I had never believed she existed. Until now. The journey was not one of distance, but of surrender. The deeper I moved into the untouched mire, the more I had to give of myself. The air thickened not with moisture, but with thought. I felt watched not by eyes, but by memory. The swamp remembered every step I had ever taken, and now it questioned my right to walk it. I bled from the soles of my feet, the ground leaching something from me I couldn't name. Hunger, perhaps. Fear. Identity. At last, I came to a clearing ringed with dying trees, their trunks twisted into shapes that almost looked human, torsos bent in agony, arms reaching out before being swallowed by bark. And in the center, there lay a cocoon. Not of silk, of living vine. A shell of pulsing green and brown, covered in glyphs that shimmered with wet light. It throbbed like a heart. She lay inside. I reached for the cocoon, not to open it, but to ask. And it opened itself. The vines retracted with a whisper like wind over bone, and there she was, Morinth. Not a girl. Not a woman. Something in between. Her skin was smooth, translucent, glowing faintly with the light of the roots. Her hair was a tangle of moss and thread vines. Her eyes opened slowly, and when they did, I saw the entire swamp reflected in them, its joy, its pain, its betrayal. "You are not of the Pact," she said. "Not fully," I replied. "You carry the blades, Echo." I didn't answer. She sat up slowly. Her joints cracked like old wood in winter. "You seek to save what has already chosen to die." "No," I said. "I seek to remember it." That made her pause. She looked at me differently then, not as a threat, not as a mistake, but as a possibility. "I dreamed of you," she whispered. "Once before I was buried. You stood at the edge of fire and chose not to burn. I wondered what kind of coward you were." "Not a coward," I said. "A thief." She smiled. Not kindly. We spoke until the roots shifted beneath us, marking the rise of the moon. She told me of Valen's second birth, not in flesh, but in memory. That every time someone touched the blade with fear in their heart, he woke. That he was not a man anymore, but an idea. A loop. And that the swamp had begun to fail because too many pact bearers had begun to doubt. Doubt cracked the pact more than Blade ever could. "Will you stop him?" she asked. "I don't know if I can." "Then let me give you what I was meant to keep." She kissed my forehead and I felt something break inside me. Not pain. Not joy. Just weight. As if I'd been living half my life underwater and she had suddenly reminded my lungs how to breathe. The mire sang in my veins. Roots threaded into my thoughts. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a foreigner wearing borrowed flesh. I belonged. She stood then, eyes aglow, and looked toward the dark beyond the trees. "He's coming," she said. "Valen?" "No," she said. "You." And in that moment, I understood the choice that would come. Not between life and death. Not even between Pact and Blade. But between being Valen and ending him. Because the silver-eyed king was not behind us. He was ahead. And I was walking straight into his shadow. They led me to the tree before I knew I had followed. Morinth had spoken no command, made no gesture, yet the roots obeyed as if her thoughts had whispered through every vein of the mire. The ground itself shifted beneath us, not violently, but with a slow, living groan, as though the swamp had not moved in centuries and now stretched old bones to make way for something sacred. The way was not a path, not even in the sense of instinct. It was more like a memory buried deep in the soil, awakening only now as I walked with new blood in my veins and old voices singing beneath my skin. The air grew heavy with stillness. Not silence, no, there was sound everywhere. A low thrum, the soft drip of water from branch to puddle, the rustle of vines coiling in places I could not see. But it was stillness nonetheless. The kind that warned you not to speak. The kind that made you feel watched by something older than gods. The ashroot tree did not announce itself. It waited. When we reached the clearing, it was not the tree that struck me first, it was the ground. Black. Burned. Charred in a perfect circle. As if lightning had struck the earth and then never left. The soil was cracked and lifeless, and yet it pulsed once every few seconds like a dying heartbeat. And in the center stood the tree. Not tall. Not wide. Just wrong. Its bark was the color of bone soaked in tar, its branches curled downward like claws, and from its roots hung remnants of things I could not name. Not corpses. Not holy. They were failures, perhaps. Testaments to those who came before me and broke beneath whatever trial this cursed place demanded. Morinth stood behind me, her voice low and steady. This is where the first dreamer buried her memory of Valen. Her doubt. Her shame. I turned to her, the ache in my chest growing. Why shame? She loved him, she said. Not as a woman loves a man, but as one dreamer loves another when their visions are the same until they suddenly aren't. She walked forward, bare feet making no sound on the scorched ground. He wanted to sever the world from its past. She wanted to let it grow wild. She could have stopped him early. She did not. That hesitation, that mercy, cost everything. The ash root creaked, a sound not unlike breath drawn through broken ribs. She locked her guilt here, Morinth said. And now it will weigh yours. I stepped forward, not because I was brave, not because I was ready, but because every other step in my life had somehow led to this one. As my feet touched the blackened soil, something pierced my mind, not like a knife. Like roots slipping into my thoughts, wrapping gently around memories, testing them. The blade I had drawn, the pact I had worn, the blood I had spilled in defense of a village that once tried to hang me, the forgiveness I had never asked for, the violence I had stopped enjoying. Every choice I thought I had made, the tree now remembered, weighing them not as a judge, but as a mirror. And then it showed me the moment I tried to forget. A face, young and bloodied. A boy, maybe 15, his hands raised in surrender. My blade already halfway through him. Bandit, they'd said. Deserved it, they'd said. but I remembered the fear in his eyes. The way he whispered for his mother as he died. The way I didn't stop, not because he was a threat, but because I wanted to be the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate. And in doing so, I became something far worse. The ash root pulsed. A tendril emerged from beneath its bark, long, vine-like, but covered in sharp, glinting thorns. It reached toward me, slow and trembling, not to harm, but to know. I held out my arm. The vine wrapped around my wrist and the thorns bit in. I didn't flinch. Pain was expected. What I didn't expect was the vision. I stood in the same swamp, but it was empty. Dead. No green. No life. Only a sprawling wasteland of cracked stone and shattered roots. The waters were gone, replaced by fissures leaking dull red light, like blood from an old wound that never healed. In the distance, a black tower rose, not built, but grown, as if the last tree of the world had decided to mock everything it once stood for. And at its peak stood Valen, but not as I remembered. His form was shifting, made of armor, bone, smoke, and memory. The silver eyes were brighter now, wider, as if fed by every fear he had ever created. And he held the blade, not in his hand, but inside his chest, pulsing like a second heart. "You think you were different," he said. His voice was whined through dead leaves. "But you wear my shadow." "I don't want what you wanted," I said. "One has nothing to do with it. You carry it. Every wound you avenge, every choice you justify, you water the seed I left behind." I looked down at my hands. Bark, blood, metal. Nothing felt like my own. "You cannot kill what you are," he whispered. And then he reached toward me. I fell backward, gasping. The vine retracted. The ash root went still. And in that moment, the pulsing beneath the earth stopped. For the first time in weeks, the swamp was quiet. Then Morinth stepped forward. She looked at me not with pity, but with recognition. "You saw it," she said. "I was it," I whispered. "Good," she replied. "Now you know what must be done." I looked down at my wrist. The thorns had carved a spiral into my skin, one I had seen before, on the blade, on the altar, on the door to the chapel. The mark of the original pact. The first vow. The one not made in words, but in truth. I stood. The ashroot tree was now empty. Hollow. Its duty complete. Whatever happened next, I would carry that weight. Not to purge the world, but to remember it. Because memory is what separates a curse from a choice. And I had made mine. It began with the birds. Not their cries, but the absence of them. No wings flapped above the reeds. No feathers scattered across the water. Only silence. Not the reverent hush of a swamp asleep or the breathless still of a predator's weight, but a void, thick and unnatural. It pressed in from the north like a blanket of cold smoke, folding over the trees, swallowing sound, scent, and even memory. The mire recoiled. The roots shrank. The pact-bound children fell into strange trances, their mouths murmuring forgotten names while their eyes turned milky with fear. Elders, who once wove chants from the fibers of the earth, now sat huddled in circles, their chants faltering mid-hymn, voices cracking like brittle branches. The land was forgetting itself. He was coming. I stood atop a fallen willow, its great body now a hollow shell of bark and despair. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from knowing. Knowing that the swamp, once a living god with 1,000 dreams, was beginning to unravel beneath the weight of one dream too old, too angry to die. Valen had begun his march. And it was not his feet that touched the soil. It was his shadow. I saw it first as a ripple in the air, a distortion of the light where no heat existed. Like a smear of oil on water, warping the colors of the world around it. Leaves browned and fell as it passed. The pools turned to ink. Animals, those that hadn't fled, froze mid-motion, their bodies collapsing into dust the moment the distortion touched them. This was not a man. This was not even a being. It was the memory of destruction resurrected through belief and fed by fear. The dream of Valen had been kept alive too long, nurtured by vengeance and by silence. And now it had grown teeth. He did not march alone. Beneath his presence walked husks, shells of once human forms, draped in mold-eaten cloaks and iron masks. Their hands ended in thorns, some holding broken blades, others holding the bones of the people they had been. I recognized one of them. An old brigand I had slain in my first year on this cursed land. His chest was caved in where I had run him through. But his face, even under rusted iron, held the same smirk he wore when he laughed as the village burned. Valen's army was not of flesh. It was of memory, and every sin left to rot in silence had now returned to walk again. I returned to the village. The air was thick with dread. Not panic, not yet, but a low, pulsing tension that made people move slower, speak softer, look away from each other as though eye contact might reveal the truth they didn't want to name. The ground near the chapel had cracked open, and dark sap seeped from the roots, sign of the Pact's pain. Children clung to their parents. The trees whispered of endings. The dreamers had stopped dreaming. I gathered them. All of them. The wounded. The changelings. The swamp-bound and the foreign-born. I stood atop the old stone where the first vow was spoken, and I told them the truth. That Valen's shadow was real. That it came not for blood, but for memory to erase, to remake, to hollow out every soul until only obedience remained. Some wept. Some laughed. One man drew a dagger and demanded I leave, screaming that I had brought this plague upon them. He wasn't wrong. I had carried the blade. I had spoken Valen's name aloud. I had sought the truth, not realizing that truth had a hunger. But still, I stood. I told them I would stay, that I would fight. Not to save them, but to show them they were worth saving. And one by one, they chose. Kalen, the old hunter whose eyes had gone blind, but whose arrows still sang truer than any storm, stepped forward. "Let me shoot first," he said. "I've been dreaming of that bastard since the war. I think it's time we stop dreaming." Then Lyra, whose son had turned to bark and wandered into the roots, her hands still stained with sap from the night she tried to hold him back. "If he takes everything," she said, "let's make sure he chokes on it." Even the youngest, a girl named Sen, whose arms had not yet grown into vines, but who already hummed with the rhythm of the Pact, stood and offered her blood to the earth, whispering a prayer so old that the trees stilled just to hear it. We were not warriors. We were not holy. We were not whole. But we were enough. That night, I returned to the chapel. Inside, the blade waited, not in a place of honor, but on the altar where the swamp's breath pooled in slow, green mist. The vines had parted for it. The stone had cracked around it. It pulsed faintly as if it, too, had begun to remember. I did not reach for it. Instead, I knelt. I pressed my palm to the altar and whispered, "Not for revenge. Not for power. Not for purification." The roots responded. I felt them curl around me, not to bind, but to lift. And the blade rose with me. Not because I was chosen, but because I had chosen. Outside, the wind shifted. Not air. Not storm. But presence. Valen had crossed the final waterline. By morning, he would reach us, and the land would either dream again or fall silent forever. Dawn did not come. Not truly. The sky above the mire only deepened into a bruised red, not from the rising sun, but from the lightless horizon devoured by shadow. It was the color of old wounds, flesh long since split, scabbed over by memory, now reopened and weeping across the sky. Trees that once bowed gently in the breath of the swamp now stood stiff, their leaves curling inward as if even they feared to face what walked toward us. The water turned stagnant, thick with rot, not from decay but from anticipation. The kind of stillness before a scream. The kind of hush before a world stops being what it was. The boundary was breaking, and we were the last thing standing between the swamp and a silence more permanent than death. We gathered around the old chapel where the roots first touched stone. There were no horns, no grand speeches, just the sound of sharpening blades, of hands binding arms with bark-stitched leather, of breath shared between people who had never called each other family but who now stood ready to die as if they were born in the same blood. I moved among them, the blade strapped across my back, not as a symbol but as a promise. Its weight was no longer unfamiliar. It throbbed with the pulse of the mire, as if each heartbeat was not mine alone but part of something vast and ancient, whispering, "Remember, remember, remember." Kalen crouched near the northern rise, his blind eyes closed, listening to the wind with the serenity of a man who had lived long enough to accept death but not fear it. He had smeared his arrows with sap mixed with blood, his own. He told me it would make them sing louder. I did not ask what that meant. Lyra walked along the perimeter of the village, weaving charms made of reeds and bone, muttering hymns too broken to rhyme, too raw to soothe. She carried her son's final toy, half-rotted, half-grown over with moss, and wore it at her belt like a talisman. She said she would meet him again in dream or death, and she would not come empty-handed. Even the pack-bound came, Sen among them, the youngest, now with tendrils sprouting gently from her wrists, her voice already fused with the cadence of the swamp. She held no weapon, only a stone, black and smooth, humming softly with a vibration that shook the bones just slightly. It was enough. Morinth did not come, but I could feel her presence at the edge of the root lines, watching, perhaps guiding, perhaps grieving. The swamp did not choose favorites. It remembered all equally, and it had already begun to mourn. Then the mist changed. It grew thin, and cold, and colorless, and through it walked the first of them. They did not charge. They did not scream. They drifted forward like ash blown across a dying field, the husks of Valen's memory, dozens, hundreds, each carved with the scars of their former selves. Some wore pieces of armor. Others dragged rusted tools. A few still held books, open and blank, as if they could not remember why they had ever read. One stopped mid-step, looked to the side, and tilted its head toward a reed as if hearing a name it had forgotten. Then it collapsed into dust. Memory undone. Behind them came the echo of a bell. A single toll. Then another. Each louder than the last. It was not a bell. It was his step. Valen emerged from the mist like the center of a dream you had tried too long to forget. His form shimmered, not like flame, not like mist, but like something half-built from thought and hunger. A man. A giant. A god. A shadow. He shifted between them all. His armor was not metal, but prayer layered in voices, twisted into commands, every piece humming with the faith of those who had once followed him. His face was not whole. One side bore the visage of the prophet I once saw in vision, beautiful, silver-eyed, resolute. The other was a hollow socket where belief had rotted to madness. From the center of his chest, the first blade jutted like a stake of judgment, pulsing with the rhythm of a world he no longer belonged to. He looked upon us. And in that moment, half of those gathered fell to their knees. Not from fear, but from recognition. They saw him in themselves. The part that longed to cleanse the rot with fire. The part that craved finality over struggle. The part that whispered, let it end. I screamed then, not a war cry, not a command, but a name. Valen. And the blade on my back caught flame, not fire, but memory, pure and blinding. We charged. It was not graceful. It was not glorious. It was chaos stitched to desperation, fury wrapped in love. Kalen loosed his arrows, each one whistling with blood sap, each one carving a line of light through the air before bursting against the husks in flashes of memory. When they died, they did not bleed, they recalled fragments of life spilling from their skulls, a mother's lullaby, a laugh in winter, the taste of rain. Lyra danced between the lines, her charm bones rattling like war drums, each twirl casting small waves of silence that broke the enemy's cohesion. And me? I cut. The blade did not hum. It screamed. With every swing, it devoured not just flesh, but forgetting. I cleaved through husks and memories poured out, names I didn't know, moments I hadn't lived. Each one pierced me. Each one added to the weight of who I had become. I was not a man. I was a vessel of everything this land had lost. Then Valen moved. He did not strike with a blade. He spoke, and his voice cracked the earth. He said, I remember you. And in that moment, I was no longer in the mire. I was in a chamber of white. Stone walls. High windows. Sunlight. I was a soldier again. My hand bloodied from execution. My oath still fresh. Valen stood across from me, younger, whole, gentle-eyed. You followed me, he said. And I had. In the old days, in the old wars. I had followed him. I had believed. The Dree fire burned from the inside out. When I returned to the swamp, everything was fire. Not flame, but thought. Not smoke, but memory. The final Dree fire had awakened, not to consume, but to reveal. Every tree was lit from within. Every drop of water shimmered with stories. And in the heart of it all, Valen stumbled. His form flickered. The blade in his chest cracked. He looked at me, eyes wide, voice now a whisper. What have you remembered? I stepped forward. Everything. I remembered everything. Not just his sins. Not just mine. But the hope we shared before the fall. The moment before ruin. And in that moment, I saw that he had once been human. Just a man. Not a monster. And that was why he had to end. Not with hate, but with memory. I drove the blade into the earth. And the fire took him. Not in wrath, but in peace. He faded. Not screaming, but smiling. When the fire faded, when the dream fire finally sank into the loam and the air stopped trembling, I stood in the hollow silence of what remained. Not destruction, not victory, but remembrance. The kind that clings to your bones like mist, settling behind your eyes so that every blink is a flash of someone you couldn't save. The kind of silence that doesn't come after battle, but after something more final. A judgment. A reckoning. The mire was still, and yet it watched. Every tree, every tendril of vine, every stretch of drowned earth breathed in unison, as if the land itself had drawn a single shaking breath, one it had been holding for generations. Valen was gone, truly gone, not slain, not vanquished like some storybook tyrant, but remembered, absorbed by the land he had tried to unmake, unraveled not by hate, but by the very memories he had feared. The blade I had wielded, no longer glowing, no longer warm, lay buried at the edge of the clearing, its surface now dark and still. It pulsed faintly, not like a weapon, but like a heartbeat, a scar on the world, a reminder, The others gathered slowly, cautiously, like dreamers waking from a long and bitter sleep. Kalen limped from the root line, blood caked on his leg and brow, but his hands steady. His blind eyes were closed, but I saw him smile faintly when he heard the quiet. He knew. Lyra emerged carrying two bodies. A young pact-bound girl who had fallen mid-prayer, and a husk with no face left, just a tangled ruin of old cloth and bone. She said nothing as she laid them side by side. She only knelt, whispered a song that made the reeds shiver, and pressed her forehead to the soil. In that moment, she was not grieving. She was remembering, and the swamp remembered with her. The rest, those who had survived the assault, wandered between the roots as if seeing them for the first time. They spoke softly, touched the bark with reverence, tasted the air like it might be different. And it was. Not sweeter, not cleaner, but honest. The swamp no longer wore a veil. It no longer hid its old scars. They were part of the dream now. Sen found me last. She was streaked in soot and sap, her eyes wide but clear. The black stone she had carried was gone, but something glowed faintly beneath her skin. Thin green veins of light tracing her arms and neck like vines that had taken root within her. She did not speak at first. She only stared at me, as if trying to decide whether I was still me or something else entirely. Finally, she stepped close and touched my chest. "You're part of it now," she whispered, "like the rest of us." I nodded, because she was right. That night we did not sleep, not out of fear, but because none of us wanted to miss what the mire was saying. Faint lights danced between the reeds, ghosts, memories, dreams. I could not tell them apart anymore, and it no longer mattered. I saw faces I recognized. A woman I'd stolen from in my past life, standing arm in arm with the man who had taught me to fight. Children who had vanished into the roots long ago now danced in silence, trailing laughter like ripples in the air. I saw myself, younger and angry, chasing shadows in cities long turned to ruin. And I saw Valen just once, standing by the water's edge, his face whole again, gazing up at the stars with a sadness that did not reach his smile. He faded like mist when I blinked. The pact-bound gathered in a wide ring that night, and the trees bent gently overhead. The elder dreamers, those who had survived, began to hum. No words, just tone and breath and rhythm. The swamp responded. The roots moved beneath us, not threatening, but cradling. The mire accepted us anew, not as its weapons, not as its sacrifices, but as its memory keepers. The great tree in the center, the one they once called the heartroot, split open. From within it came light, soft, golden, familiar, and I understood then. This was not the end of the dream. This was the waking, when morning finally came. Not red, not dark, but true, with a pale orange light that stretched over the reeds like a breath held too long. It was the first real dawn in years. Birds returned. Their songs were hesitant at first, but they came. Frogs croaked along the banks. Insects buzzed, alive and bright. The land exhaled. We walked the edges of the village, counting who was left. There were fewer than I had hoped, more than I had feared. Some were changed. Some would never speak again. But all of them had seen the truth, and none of them would forget it. I returned to the chapel before noon, alone. The blade still sat buried, halfway into the root line where I'd driven it. I crouched beside it, touched its hilt. It no longer called to me. It no longer needed to. I whispered a final vow into the soil, not for vengeance, not for legacy, but for memory, that this place would never be forgotten, that its mistakes would not be buried, that its truth would be told, again and again, until no one dared repeat it. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Sen stood there, barefoot in the moss, her eyes now glowing faintly with the same green light as the roots beneath us. She said only, "They want to make you a root walker." I smiled, and for once it wasn't bitter. I already am, and so I stayed, not as a warrior, not as a savior, but as a witness, to tell the story of the mire, of Valen, of the pact, of how belief can rot, how memory can save, and how even the most broken man can choose to remember what matters. And in the silence that followed, I knew the swamp had not healed, but it had remembered, and that was enough. The days after the dream fire drifted like smoke, formless, slow, and impossible to grasp. I would wake each morning unsure of whether I still lived or had become another echo in the mire. Time passed differently here now, not by the march of hours but by the pulse of the roots beneath our feet. The village, if it could still be called that, had transformed. The old shacks had collapsed or been reclaimed entirely by the swamp. In their place rose structures of living wood, bark-woven walls that pulsed faintly with green veins, roofs curved like leaves mid-unfurling. They weren't built, they were grown, as if the swamp, in waking, had decided to cradle those who remained rather than devour them. And we accepted that embrace, not out of submission but understanding. The pact was no longer a burden, it was a bond. I had become something more than a man, not a god, not a weapon, but a root walker. That's what Sen called me now, and it echoed from the others in whispers, half reverent, half fearful. It wasn't a title I claimed, but one they gave me, and perhaps it fit. I could hear the roots now, not as voices, not as words, but as memories. When I placed my palm to the bark of the heartroot, visions bled into me. Not dreams, not hallucinations, but echoes of what had been. I saw Valen as a child, chasing a wooden hoop through dust-choked streets. I saw the swamp as it was before the pact, teeming with beasts, wild and free. I saw the first dreamers carving symbols into stone with trembling hands, terrified not of what they were becoming, but of what they were leaving behind. And I saw myself, again and again, from angles no eyes could capture. Standing, kneeling, weeping, rising. Kalen passed 3 days after the battle. He knew it was coming. He had seen it in the ripples of the air, heard it in the stillness of the leaves. He asked me to sit with him one last time beneath the root lines, where the reeds grew tall and the water sang. His voice was weak, but his words were sharp. "Don't let them turn you into a statue," he said. "The swamp doesn't need saints. It needs truth." I promised him I would remember that. He smiled, touched the bark one final time, and whispered a name I didn't recognize. Then he stopped breathing. The reeds bowed as he passed. The water went still, and the roots took him not with violence but with gentleness. They remembered him. Lyra vanished the following dusk. No one saw her leave. No one heard her steps. But in the morning, her charms were gone. Her staff snapped in half and left at the foot of the heartroot like an offering. A thin trail of bone fragments led north, toward the old burial stones. Some say she went to join her son, to sing to him across the vale. Others say the swamp finally called her home. I don't think she died. I think she changed, like so many of us. Sen stayed. She walked the new paths with a presence that grew daily. Her voice deeper, her limbs longer, the glow in her skin no longer faint but vibrant. The swamp bloomed around her. Where she stepped, flowers with no name took root. She became something not quite human, not quite spirit, a bridge between the old and the new. And I watched her grow with a mix of pride and sorrow. I had been chosen to hold the blade. She had been chosen to plant it. That's what the blade had become now. Not a weapon, but a seed. The heartroot had absorbed it, slowly, over days, until only the hilt remained visible, jutting from the trunk like a relic. But the energy still thrummed, still reached out. The blade had taken from me everything I had once been. My rage, my selfishness, my endless hunger for escape, and replaced it with weight, with memory. I was not free of it. I never would be, but I understood it now. I accepted it. That was the Rootwalker's burden. The dreamers called for a new pact, not the old blood binding, not the silence that came with it, but a living oath, made not in desperation but in clarity. I was asked to speak it, to forge it. So on the 7th day, I stood again before the heartroot. The village gathered in a ring, old and young, human and bound alike. They brought nothing with them but breath and silence. No drums, no fire, only roots beneath our feet and stars above. I stepped forward, my hand on the blade's hilt, and spoke, not with grandeur, but with gravity. We are the swamp, I said. We are its memory, its wound, its cure. We do not rule it. We walk with it. We bleed with it. We remember for it. This land is not ours to conquer or cleanse. It is ours to know, to speak for, to answer to. No more false gods, no more silent pain, only truth, only roots, only dream. I pressed my palm to the bark. It opened, not literally, but within me. Something bloomed. The last of the blade's fire surged, not in violence, but in recognition. It passed through me like a tide, and I saw it all. Every life lost, every name forgotten, every whispered vow and every broken promise. I saw the mire's full memory, not as a story, but as a being. And I did not weep. I let it in. Behind me, Sen began to hum. Others joined her. A low song. No words, just tone and breath and rhythm. The same song the elder dreamers had once sung. The same one Kalen had taught me in broken fragments. The mire answered not with words, but with stillness, with peace. The roots stopped trembling. The light dimmed, and I knew the pact had been made. A living one, bound not by fear, but by memory. That night, I sat alone on the hill where Valen once stood. The sky was dark and honest. No red, no rot, just stars. A wind moved across the mire, gentle and clear. I thought of the cities I'd fled, the men I'd robbed, the lives I'd ruined. I thought of the man I was when I arrived here, lost, violent, empty. And I thought of the man I was now. I was still flawed, still burdened, but I was rooted. And I knew then, finally, that I would not leave, because this was no longer a swamp of death and silence. It was a place of memory, of living stories, and I had become one of them. I don't know if anyone outside the swamp still remembers us. I don't know if they care. The roads that led here have long since been claimed by the roots and the rain, and the trade paths that once carried coin and cruelty alike have crumbled into silence. Travelers no longer come this way, not out of fear, but because the mire no longer calls them. It has no need. It has us now. It has our stories. And more than anything, it remembers. That's what this place has become. A wound that chose to heal with its scars intact. Not pretty, not clean, but real, alive, and still dreaming. I sit now at the edge of the old chapel ruin, though there's little left of it beyond stone half swallowed by moss and ivy. The roots have grown over the pews, split the altar in two. Where Valen once made his seat of whispers and rot, flowers now bloom. Wild things with too many petals and a scent like memory. Bitter, sharp, strangely familiar. The kind of scent that makes you remember your mother's hands or the face of someone you wronged. I visit this place often, not to pray, but to listen. The roots speak if you're quiet enough. Not in words, in feeling, in breath. Children run here now. They laugh as they duck between branches and leap over pools. None of them are bound. None of them carry the old pact marks, but the swamp still knows them. It brushes their cheeks with vines and lifts them when they fall. The trees open gently for them, not to consume, but to cradle. I watch them and feel something heavy inside me soften. We did not save this place by burning it down. We saved it by remembering what it had been and forgiving what it had become. Sen has changed completely. She no longer speaks in the way she once did. Her words come less with sound and more with presence. When she looks at you, it's like the swamp itself is weighing your truth. She walks barefoot, her skin now threaded with moss and bark, and flowers bloom wherever she kneels. Some call her a goddess. She always laughs when they do, but she never denies it. Not anymore. She has become something more than a girl who survived. She is the dream's keeper, its voice, its heart. And I walk beside her still, but not as her guide, as her shadow. I carry the stories now. That is my role, to remember, to tell, and sometimes to warn, because though the rot has faded, it has not vanished. There are still places where the mud bubbles strange and black, where whispers return to the ears of those who walk without purpose. I've seen the dark take hold of men who came with axes and fire, thinking the swamp weak again. It isn't. It never was. And it does not forget its pain. It simply chooses now to forgive when it can. Kalen's staff still leans against the heartroot. It has grown into the bark itself, becoming a part of the great tree's pulse. When I touch it, I remember his voice, dry, bitter, kind in its own jagged way. I remember his stories, his songs, his stubbornness. He didn't want to be a prophet. He just wanted to matter. And now he does. Forever. The dream remembers him. Lyra's charms hang from the chapel's broken beams, still rattling softly in the wind. Some nights, I hear her voice in them. Not words, just that humming lullaby. The one she sang to her son. The one the mire now sings back. And Valen? He is still here. Not as a shadow, not as a tyrant, but as regret. The kind of regret that lingers even after the wound is gone. The kind that teaches, warns, guides. I don't hate him. Not anymore. I see now what he tried to do, how he twisted memory into power, how he feared being forgotten so deeply that he scorched the land just to leave a mark. But the swamp doesn't remember you for how loud you screamed. It remembers you for what you left behind. And me? I was a thief, killer, a ghost in 100 cities who never left anything behind but blood and whispers. But here, I became something else. Not because I was chosen, but because I chose. To listen, to stay, to carry the weight even when it hurt. And now I walk the root paths each dawn, barefoot like Sen taught me. I press my hand to the bark of the dream trees and ask, "Who are you today?" Sometimes they answer with rain, sometimes with silence. Both are enough. I have no grave, no family, no name that anyone beyond this mire would know. But I am remembered by the trees, by the mud, by the breath of a swamp that once screamed in pain and now sings in peace. That is enough. That is everything.